I had the privilege of going to Normandy in May of 2018. And a couple things really happened that were quite profound when I was there. First and foremost, when you're at a place physically, it really makes it real. And when you spend the better part of your life kind of reading about it and idealizing it and hearing the myths and the narratives surrounding it, being there and actually seeing things like the American cemetery at Omaha Beach is quite transformative. It suddenly makes it very real, and it's no longer just something that's a talking point in a speech or something that you've read about on the books of or the pages of a book. So I don't know. So the anniversary's here. The June 6th anniversary of DDay itself is coming past, but right now is the anniversary, in a sense, of what happened after the landing. So I think Americans have a kind of unfortunate way of looking at what happened in 1944 in the summer in France as kind of a be-all, end-all of really a 12-hour stretch of time from 6:30 in the morning when U.S. soldiers disembarked from troop ships to land on the coast, and till the evening when the beachheads were tentatively secured. And people kind of think, oh, Normandy, D-Day, it happened, that's what happened. And even more simplistically to the narrative surrounding a particular place and point, Omaha Beach. People think, of this entire massive Herculean struggle on a scale really none of us can really fathom in just like this tiny little subsection, this tiny little fragment in time. So I really kind of wanted for a long time to really widen people's understanding and just be like, okay, this is what happened before, this is what happened during, this is what happened after, because it didn't end after we secured the beaches. A beachhead is so fragile. It's like an egg. You can crush it really easily, or you can quite simply just push it back into the sea and then it's gone. So at the time in 1944, Eisenhower was not at all certain that it was going to succeed. I mean, he lived in quite a state of angst, with some tentative optimism, for weeks after we had landed. So it's like, well, what happened afterwards? And then, once people start to learn more about something, the simplistic narratives start to fade away. And we start to learn more about the true natures and horrors of war. So I don't know. I think it's important. So I really appreciate you guys. You're all pretty close to family, if not just outright family. So I appreciate you being here. But maybe this is kind of the beginning of something larger for me in terms of being able to share with people a broader understanding of an event that's all too often pared down into something much smaller than it actually was. For agendas that I don't really want to get into now, but there are agendas surrounding that. So the first thing I really want to touch on is the German perspective of the invasion before and as it immediately began to happen, because it seems that the loser's perspective is almost always omitted for most histories, and that's really to make things as simplistic as possible. And as I've said previously, the whole point of this is to make it rich and complex, and for folks to understand, the whole and not just a single viewpoint. So the man who really is in charge of all of the things you see in the photographs and the movies, the tank traps, the steel barriers, the bunkers, the mines, the barbed wire, the gun emplacements, the massive howitzers, along the entire Atlantic coast, the Atlantic Wall, as it was called, was Erwin Rommel. And you may have heard of Erwin Rommel. He was a German field marshal who had served with distinction in North Africa and up into 1944, but also was given the task of solidifying the coast of the Atlantic against any possible Allied invasion. Part of the reasons that complete tactical surprise was achieved on June the 6th, and that was really surprising. I mean, it's pretty damn hard to hide a seaborne invasion, especially when you're talking about tens of thousands of people and thousands of ships. The fact that we achieved tactical surprise isn't as much to our own as allies, I say we, but as much to the allies' achievement as it is to the hubris of the defenders. because Erwin Rommel really had done everything in his mind that he could do to fortify the beach and make it, in his mind, impassable to attack. And you know, he had relayed that, you know, quite clearly to the higher ups, even up to Hitler. So the idea was, you know, we've done everything we can to make this as formidable an obstacle as possible. So that's the first point, you know, that they didn't see the invasion coming. And one of the reasons the invasion ultimately succeeded. Hitler personally believed that any invasion that hit the beach would be destroyed. He was adamant in the belief that whatever the Allies would land at the coast would be destroyed outright there, and nothing would happen of it. And this idea was never really challenged because you didn't challenge Hitler. Authoritarian regimes seem to work that way, and if you do, you tend to get shot. So Hitler really made his own bed here. But regardless, another idea was this German concept that whoever hit the beach just simply wasn't going to be as good as who was defending. And this is just so untrue, it's difficult to get into, you know, because the levels of analysis on which that statement is untrue is essentially bottomless. But, you know, the Aryan state and white supremacy lends itself to the idea that there are such a thing as superior humans. And the Germans brought that mentality, especially to the defense of the Normandy beaches. Alfred Jodl, who's the chief of staff of the Oberkommando West, especially the Command and Control West, situated in Paris, stated, he said, quote, and I'll read it, "We shall see who fights harder and who dies easier. The German soldier fared with the destruction of his homeland, or the Americans and the English, who don't even know any longer what they are fighting for in Europe." So it's kind of a fancy way of saying we're just so damn tough. You know, it doesn't matter how many of them there are, or how many tanks they can produce, or how much they bomb us. At the end of the day, we're fighting for our homeland. And the Nazi state was really intertwined with this pseudo-religious ideology that the land and the people and the state were one and the same. So this is why you really, and without getting too far off track, this is why you really see the fanaticism of defense, you know, ratchet up and up and up the closer the Allies get to Berlin, and when they finally do step on German soil, it means quite much to a National Socialist that you're actually fighting on Germany, because the people are Germany. We are Germany. We will defend Germany. And of course, the absorption of Western Europe into the Nazi state extended Germany to the channel. So the idea was that, well, we're just so damn good and we have all these great defenses, we are going to be complacent in the fact that we will win. And that's a dangerous thing and that's a dangerous place to come from, especially when you're on the defense. The biggest problem that I've identified, and I will finally use my pokey here and my map. No, this pokey here, this one. I see you guys snickering back. Hitler and Rommel really believed the invasion was going to come at Calais. Dunkirk is right up here, and Belgium's right up here off the map. But the idea was that Hitler was thinking, well, his Operation Sea Lion, which he was going to conduct in 1941 after he reached the coast and France surrendered, he was going to launch a seaborne invasion from here, from Calais, because this is, well, the geography makes perfect sense. And the German Navy was nowhere near the strength the Allied Navy was. So in his mind, why in God's earth would I spend more time in the water than I need to, because the German army's might is not in the water? Well, he never left that thinking, even though he had every chance to listen to his intelligence, listen to his military leaders, something he was famous for not doing, and understanding that the naval capability of the Allies was just stupendously larger than his ever could have been. So this entire coastline was now fair game. But he continuously thought the attack would come at Calais. And the Allies did everything they could to make him think that. So it's not just his idiocy, it's our own deception. Hitler was terribly, in the most maliciously way conceivable, very intelligent, but as any of us could really be. He had his moments of idiocy, and thinking that the invasion could only have come at Calais was one of those moments. We actually positioned Patton and an entire army commanded by him right here in this area. So the Germans really feared General Patton, and they assumed any attack would have been launched with Patton playing a predominant role. So we purposely put him up here, and we gave General Omer Bradley overall command of the invasion, and the invasion would come down here, as you can see. So the Germans were fixated on this idea that the attack, if it came, would be destroyed, that the attack, if it came, would be up here. And the Germans, to their detriment ultimately, put most of their divisions here, right up here, where theoretically they could respond into Normandy if they needed to, but it was much easier for them to come up into Calais. So this is where most of the divisions were, and as you can see, the Seine River actually cuts them off. And there's a series of water obstacles down here on that flank, the actual Norman hedgerow country, that make it quite difficult to move divisions in. And once you've committed them there, they're stuck there. So the Germans had put most of their armor and most of their troops up here, most of their crack troops. And remember, I said the Germans really believed that their personal superiority in their being supermen would defeat the Allies. Well, they had actually positioned quite a large number of Osttruppen in this area because they thought it was of second priority. I'm talking about Russian prisoners who were starving, and the Germans came into the camp and said, hey, we will feed you if you put on this German uniform. And then you can go sit in a bunker in Normandy. When I was in Normandy, actually up in this area here, in the 101st area where they were fighting, I went to a museum where there were actually Osttruppen uniforms and pieces, and there's actually a DP-28 machine gun that was captured at that crossroads I went to, and a DP-28 is a Russian light machine gun. So they gave them back their Russian weapons and sent them in as rear line troops. So the plan, as you can see, is filled with fallacy. Another big problem was that right in early June, the weather was so bad, as famously understood, that it was postponed multiple times, and these soldiers had to keep embarking and disembarking from their troops because the weather was so bad. Well, Hitler truly believed that the weather was so bad they would never launch, and they would never launch where they did. And if they did launch, they would fail. And if they did launch, our troops were so much better, so it was just, you see, it's a perfect storm. So we really have kind of organically come to the invasion itself. Allow me to turn my page. I appreciate your guys' patience with me. We have a nice little soundtrack going on here. As soon as June the 5th, the day before the invasion, a report came from Oberkommando West in Paris to the Führer saying, essentially, there's probably an invasion brewing, but it's not going to happen anytime soon. Take our word on that. 12 hours later, the 82nd Airborne, 101st Airborne, and the British, was it the 5th or the 6th? I believe it was the 6th. Parachute dropped into Normandy, and the invasion was on. So they were wrong. Due to the tide charts, the landings were going to occur in succession as the tide, ebbed. They wanted to hit at low tide so you could see all the mines and things. You had quite a bit more open area to cover, which the Germans didn't expect, but you could see all the obstacles and you weren't running into them with your boats. Let's wait till the end. So the first beach was Utah at 6:30 in the morning, and then time essentially went about an hour as the tide followed the curvature of the earth over to the Sword Beach, which hit about an hour later at 7:30. So that's when the troops hit the beach. So Utah Beach was relatively lightly defended in the first place, but due to a series of happy accidents, it turns out, the troops landed about a mile from where they were supposed to be and landed on an even a more lighter defended area. So Utah Beach was relatively easy. And as was Gold, Juno, and Sword. The British hit Gold, the Canadians hit Juno, and then the British were, so it was a Commonwealth Sandwich, so to speak. And they hit here and were able to move inland relatively easily. And rather famously, as we know from Steven Spielberg's fame, Omaha Beach was one of the most bloody battles fought ever in the history of this civilization. Really, completely honestly, it was absolutely horrific, and for good reason. It really captures the attention when we think about D-Day and when we think about the quintessential experience of the D-Day beaches. We think about Omaha Beach, and for good reason, because it was bloody awful. The first thing I think to understand, trying to giving a little bit of a realistic overview of what it would have been like to hit the beach at Omaha. These men had an incredible amount of distance to cover before they reached any cover. I've been to Omaha Beach. Has anybody here been to Omaha Beach? Okay, it was my absolute privilege to have been there, and I still can't believe I've been there myself. But Omaha is an incredible place because it's like perfectly suited for an awful place to be if people were shooting at you, because you have this massive expanse of just beach, and then a couple hundred yards from the high water mark, you have about a berm about this tall. It's about 1 meter tall. And this is where the dune grass ends and its root structure holds onto earth and it's not washed away. And there's a collection of pebbles and things, and it's about, sloping at about a 70-degree angle. And that's the first cover at Omaha, and it's not cover. And then shortly beyond that, it really just begins sloping into a 45-degree angle, and there's these massive commanding bluffs that are not, I wouldn't have been able to climb them if I was there that day just for fun. There's brambles, there's all kinds, there's no paths up them. They are natural barriers. They're just keeping you where you are. But there are draws. There are draws but where the cliffs recede in, and maybe a little stream is a little culvert, and there are draws. And of course those are covered with machine guns, because those are the only ways that you can come in off the beach. So these men have been on the boats for hours. A lot of them are seasick because what they're in are landing craft with flat bottoms. So every time they're not cutting through the waves, they're on top of the waves. If you've ever been in a flat bottom boat, you're really in for a ride. So these guys, a lot of them are getting seasick. They're completely weighed down with equipment. Michael, as a fellow artifact insanity enthusiast, you understand how much stuff they had to wear. And for those of you who have been subjected to some of the things I own, you understand. And then there's all the bullets, there's the water, and then there's all the extra things that they were giving them, specifically to, 1 out of every 4 men who hit the beach was an engineer to blow holes in the defenses and clear the way. And they are carrying TNT and Bangalore torpedoes and things that are so heavy. So you're seasick, and when you're supposed to run like a rabbit, you're moving like a tortoise. And one of the most hair-raising moments for me was I had reached the coast. I had reached the water line at Omaha. And I looked out, and there's the channel outside. And I turned around, and I noticed where I was standing, which was actually at the opening of the Coville Draw, underneath the American Cemetery at Omaha, there were 3 bunkers facing me. They're dark slits, just looking at me like eye sockets of a skull. It was terrible, and it was really frightening. I realized if I was standing where I was standing in 1944, that survival was, how do you survive that? You don't. And a lot of people didn't. Just to share the reality of what it was like on Omaha Beach, because you can watch a movie and what you're seeing is makeup, and to the credit of special effects and acting. But the 1st Infantry Division, the 16th Infantry Regiment, hit Omaha Beach at that place I was standing. And my grandfather was in the 16th Infantry, and he joined much later than D-Day. But this was a veteran unit that had fought through the Mediterranean campaign and was now tasked with being the first men to hit at Omaha in this incredibly dangerous place. Private First Class Norman Speckler of the 16th Infantry Regiment was carrying TNT demo equipment, because I said a lot of these guys were carrying stuff. And the German mortars were incredibly effective. Their machine guns were zeroed in, and something touched off the incredible amount of high explosives this young man was carrying, and he was gone. What remained of him, and this is the quote of Private William Funkhauser, who was close to Norman Speckler when he was vaporized. Funkhauser said, quote, "The biggest piece that remained of him was as big as my fist and as white as snow. You have no idea how truly scared I was." So this is the idea of these young men making this attack. So how do they get off this beach? How do they do it? Well, young groups of incredibly tenacious young men managed to find their way up the draws, these natural routes of advance, and they began to wreak havoc behind the German lines. Remember, these are defense troops, and it's very disconcerting to have a bunch of men who have been fighting since Sicily, suddenly causing trouble behind you. And a couple of men, John Spaulding and Phil Strasik, are mentioned, and these men were both highly decorated. They led groups of people off the beaches, and then were able to then, in many ways, contribute to the 1st Infantry Division being able to get off the beach. But that's how it happened, and it happened piecemeal. And it was really the individual who was able to do this. It was the individuals and the non-commissioned officers, the lieutenants, who were able to find the people around him, closest to him, and be able to motivate them to move. So I wish I had more individual stories of that, but I just can't get into it because we could spend hours on just what happened in Omaha. But as I said, the national fixation is on Omaha Beach, and for good reason. As I've explained to you, it's an incredibly motivating and interesting thing to study when you're thinking about this time period, but there's so much more, and that's what I really want to get into. So I mentioned that the British, the Canadians, and more British landed in a Commonwealth Sandwich, so to speak, at Gold, Sword, and Juno beaches, further in up here. So they had landed and they moved inland relatively quickly. But what they avoided at the beach that the Americans received at Omaha, they began to receive almost immediately at D+1. And when I say D+1, I'm meaning D-Day plus 1 day, because this is suddenly how we're beginning to think of time. Because, there's the day we hit the beaches, and it's just an incredible time warp that occurs when you have to imagine the fog of war, and this is truly the only way you can consider the passage of time. But D+1, the British and the Canadians moved forward on Caen and set up on this side of the Orne River here. And the idea was to capture Caen, because as you can see here, the invasion area is flanked on this side here by Caen. I guess you could call this the northern side, the western side, by Caen, or excuse me, the eastern side. Never eat soggy Wheaties. Yes, this is the eastern side. So to the east is Caen, and to the west is St. Lo. And if you can think of the Normandy battle zone, as it's soon to be called, you're going to think of like a French door, and on this door is Caen, and this door is St. Lo. They were called the tactical hinges to the Normandy battle, and being able to open one would have meant the breakout. And we'll talk about that later, because they did break out. But the British and the Canadians were to swing east and attack this hinge here at Caen, and the Americans were to swing west and attack St. Lo. And more importantly, they were going to swing west, cut off the Continental Peninsula here, and then move up and capture the port of Cherbourg, because this was a whole logistical nightmare. The bridgehead was a logistical nightmare. And one of the reasons Hitler did not think it would happen here, and he thought it would happen at Calais, is because Calais is a deep water port. How are you going to feed these men? How are you going to continue to give them ammunition, tanks, especially once the thumb screws are starting to be applied at them, because the entire German army in Western Europe is going to come right here now. So you have to supply them. So the port of Cherbourg becomes immensely important. So the Americans, instead of attacking the vital hinge of St. Lo, they push up close to it, and then swing and then capture the port of Cherbourg. And they capture the port of Cherbourg on the 29th. So it takes them almost a full month of advancing to get there. But meanwhile, Mulberry harbors have been created. If you haven't heard of them, the Mulberry Harbor was an incredible invention of floating concrete pylons to create a deep water port that was just manufactured. They actually needed them so desperately they started sinking ships to create breakwaters, and a lot of that's still off the coast of Normandy. And Hitler just had no idea of this technology. He didn't have it. He couldn't think outside of the box that it could be made. So the idea that you could even supply these people with temporary deep water ports was unfathomable. But unfortunately for them, on the 19th of June, I believe it was the 19th of June, there was what we call now the Mulberry Harbor storm, or it was one of the worst storms in 40 years, hit the coast of France and destroyed most of this harbor. So we're already seeing by June 19th the absolute critical importance of capturing a deep water port. So the Americans pause their advance to open up Normandy, and they swing up here into the Cherbourg Peninsula, and it falls by the 19th. While this is all happening, and we'll get into the American side in a minute, I really want to give some time, and checking on the time, we're doing quite well. We started a little late, and that's fine. But I just want to make sure I'm respecting your guys' time and not droning on too long. The British and the Canadians were, you see like a barroom brawl and a guy's like holding back another guy. And what's happening here is the Canadians and the British are holding the entire weight of the German Wehrmacht and the SS Panzer Corps on the Western Front, while the Americans are able to do this. The Germans are holding them off. And when I said that the majority of the German army was up here, I meant it. And right here, on the other side of the Orne River from Caen, was the 12th SS Hitlerjugend Panzer Division. And of course, by 1944, the best that they could do really to create a SS Panzer Division was to draft Hitler Youth. So a lot of these guys were 15, 16, 17 years old and indoctrinated, we'll put it that way, and ready to fight quite tenaciously. So the fight was on at D+1. And no tanks really available at this time, limited support, and just an absolute, what the British and the Canadians did at Caen and the Orne River allowed us the victory in Europe that we celebrate today. And Americans have a really good way of sucking all the air out of a space, especially with Omaha Beach. Omaha Beach. Steven Spielberg, he's our guy. Yeah, well, that happened and was able to succeed because of what was happening here in Caen. And I'll tell you a little bit about that. So it was widely accepted and understood that there would be massive armor battles in Normandy. I said I wanted to tell you guys about what happened after D-Day, because it's like D-Day happened and then we don't care anymore. What happened after D-Day is brutal. Because let me look here. I believe it was 8. Yeah. So within a couple weeks, 8 SS Panzer divisions were throwing themselves at this line right here. Montgomery was in charge over here and Bradley was in charge over here. And Montgomery, to his credit, because a lot of people really like to talk bad about Montgomery, he has a way of claiming everything went to plan after the fact, when in fact we know it didn't. We know it didn't because he was really desperately trying to outflank Caen with pincer movements. And it was just, for the British and the Canadian troops, well, I'll put it this way. One of the authors I read to learn up on this presentation to you folks put it quite bluntly. Canada bled at Caen because these young men were advancing across mostly open terrain. This is the terrain where the SS Panzer divisions were able to operate, and the Allied armor was able to operate as well. Over here is nothing but hedgerows, which doesn't quite lend itself to tanks. But up here is quite open country. So massive tank battles and massive loss of life on both sides. The Panzer divisions would never recover from what happened here. Fortunately for the Allies, we were able to replenish the people who were killed there. But what I just cannot understate the ferocity of the fighting for Caen. And in terms of just to give you guys a little bit of just like a quick overview, I want to tell you about the story of Michael Whitman, who was an SS Panzer commander in the Heavy Panzer Battalion 101. He commanded a Tiger tank and was positioned, in the sector, and had positioned himself. Now, I often kind of think of it this way, and I'll phrase it as best as I can. One of the biggest problems that the German army had in Normandy was that they were fighting Russia, and that it was like a black hole. You would throw units into Russia and you'd never see them again. They'd come back in name only. And a lot of these units who had been in Normandy up here, positioned up here, were refitting. So it was one of the biggest detriments to the German army that they were fighting the Russians. But it was one of the advantages the German army had, that they had fought the Russians. Michael Wittmann, who was commanding his Tiger tank, had been fighting since 1941. And he had positioned himself in an ambush position, and in 15 minutes he had destroyed 29 Allied vehicles. These were Canadians. It was about 50-50, 15 tanks, 14 armored personnel carriers, as well as 2 anti-tank guns. You think about 4 or 5 men in each tank. Over 100 guys, 15 minutes, killed. And this is the kind of ferocity we're seeing in these engagements. As the English are probing, they're trying to break out, but the Germans are just piling it on. And what the Germans are actually doing is they're moving a massive amount of men across the Seine from the north here into the Caen area. And especially by the Orne River, they're trying to get bridgeheads to encircle Caen. And it's just not working. And ultimately, they capture Caen by razing the city with bombing. And quite a few civilians get killed. It's a controversial, quite a controversial decision made by Montgomery. And he didn't make much comment about it after the war. During the time, he thought it was a tactical necessity. But that's eventually how it happened, was they just started carpet bombing in front of them. So this idea that we hit the beach, there was this valiant struggle at the beaches, and then we had this triumphant march and the breakout, is just not true. What happened was we hit the beach, the Allies were able to create a bridgehead, but for quite some time there was complete uncertainty whether or not this bridgehead would actually succeed. And you can just see when you really read about what was happening outside of Caen, like this one instance where a single Tiger tank takes out almost 30 vehicles, over 100 guys in 15 minutes. You know, this is happening over and over and over again, for weeks on end. And Montgomery is desperate. He's June 30th, he launches Operation Epsom to outflank Caen and cross the Orne River, and that fails because he just is stymied completely by SS Panzer troops. And then there's Operation Goodwood on July 18th and 20th, shortly, in a couple of weeks. This will have Operation Goodwood. You can think it's almost a month and a half after the landings. We still haven't taken Caen. We still haven't broken beyond the Orne River. And this is because the German tenacity of defense is so incredible. But it could have been worse. Throughout this entire time, Hitler still is adamant that the real invasion is coming at Calais, and that this is just all a farce. This is all a feint. Hitler cannot understand that that they have done it, they have created Mulberry Harbors, that they have actually created a bridgehead here, and this is threatening the entire western flank of his empire. But he believes fervently that it's up here, so he's actually keeping quite a few guys up here, and he doesn't release them. It's rather famous that Hitler was asleep the morning of June the 6th, and that they were scared to wake him up, and this allowed us to get a bridgehead. Well, sure. But I mean, even when waking, Hitler was asleep for over a month afterwards, because he thought, no, they're going to come at Calais, that's what I would do. I'm not wrong. So we've given homage to what's going on here at Calais, but I haven't talked about what's going on here at the Western Hinge, so to speak, the Western Hinge of the Normandy battle space, and that's at St. Lo. My grandfather, Grandpa Wheeler, hit the beach at Utah about a week after, and then was committed with his entire division, the 28th Infantry, to the St. Lo battle. And what was essentially happening in this area is really defined by terrain. This is a really simplistic map, but you can see some rivers here. And what's happening is this is a marshy area. This is an incredibly marshy area. You can't drive tanks over it. What you can drive tanks over are raised roads. And the Norman farmers had done quite a good job at keeping their fields neatly hemmed and differentiated from the other fields with very thick hedges that we all know now as hedgerows, the bocage country as it's called. These Norman farmers for centuries had drained it and irrigated it and kept it able to grow things. But the reality is this is quite a marshy area, and the Germans knew that. So rather quickly, before the invasion and immediately afterwards, German hydraulic engineers did their absolute best to release all that wetness into this area. So the roads that were able to be traversed by vehicles became the landmarks upon which the battle would be fought and won. And therefore, the nexus hubs through which all the roads would pass through became the tactical advantage. That's why Caen and St. Lo were the advantages. Caen was the network hub through which all the roads leading from Paris and Seine, where all the German panzer divisions, all the troops could come into the battle, they had to come through Caen, or they had to go around for miles, and that just wasn't going to work. And same thing with St. Lo. If you were going to attack St. Lo, or if you're going to attack the bridgehead, you had to control St. Lo, because that's where all the roads were. And you can't move around it because of the hedgerows. I'm talking, it's really hilarious. When I was there, I got to see these hedgerows, and they're like walls. You can't see through them. It's not like, you know, the arborvitae by our house. It's like that on steroids, but there's thorns and it's trees and it's all kinds of things. You can't walk through it. And, you know, that's to keep your cows and things from moving through, so it makes sense. So the Americans are having quite a hell of a time because terrain like this is a defender's paradise. And I remember distinctly being in this area near the 101st Airborne Drop Zones. These are little parachutes, by the way. I don't know if these are little parachutes. But I was right in here, and I remember I was walking the roads outside of Saint-Come-du-Mont, which was one of the 101st Airborne Drop Zone objectives on June the 6th. And I remember kind of like walking along a hedgerow and then kind of stepping into one, and almost immediately I found myself in a perfect position in which if I had a gun, I could have killed anybody without being seen. Behind me was bushes, you'd be looking into shadow. I had this perfect little window into the isolated, enclosed world of this field. So what would happen is the Germans would essentially create a little earthen fort on four sides, set up their mortars behind to lob shells over, and they would defend that until the Americans brought up enough guys and brought a tank in, and then they'd fall back to the next one, and then the next one. And this happened day after day, week after week, and it was just shredding divisions. It was just shredding men. And to the point where entirely fresh divisions like the 28th Infantry that my grandfather fought in, they couldn't bring them in fast enough. So the Germans, it was just, when we think about Normandy now as a people, it's this like great, you know, triumphant breakout. And what it was this hot summer, terrifying, drenched in horrible violence experience. There's nothing glorious or beautiful about it. And it was absolutely terrifying to think of myself in the shoes of an American infantryman fighting and being told, okay, somehow you survived taking this field, you're going in on the next one. Oh, you survived that too somehow? You're going in again. Somehow you made it through the day, tomorrow we're doing it all over again. How do you survive that? I don't know. I don't think you can. And a lot of these guys didn't. But what happens is after the port of Cherbourg receives priority and the Continian Peninsula is cut, St. Lo then becomes the emphasis of the attack. And Caen is holding off the German panzer divisions. But St. Lo becomes the objective to break out. Montgomery after the war said, oh, it was all going according to plan. We were to draw the German tanks on us while the Americans, you know, to the west, were able to break out. Well, Montgomery was feverishly trying to break out himself and he couldn't. But what he was doing was he was keeping the Germans off balance. So what happened was on July 19th, in a couple days, well, a couple weeks, the Americans took St. Lo and the road was open. Operation Cobra occurred shortly thereafterwards. On July the 25th, they gave themselves about 6 days to get men in from the beach, tanks, and then they sent it. They went around and they suddenly flanked the entire German buildup that had happened around Caen. Suddenly the Americans were here and the Germans were caught here. and they didn't know what to do. Right down here, further down the Orne River, is this place called Felice. You might have heard of it because of this thing called the Felice Gap. This is when nearly the entirety of this massive buildup of SS Panzer troops, German Wehrmacht, etc., their support personnel, were suddenly caught with their pants down because the Americans were behind them, and they couldn't pull back over the ground they had just covered. And the Felice Gap so mauled the German army in the West. A German officer later said, whatever units that managed to fall back through Paris were just completely useless to us. They were so destroyed. And by now, I said the Germans, one of the greatest issues that they had was that they were fighting in Russia. One of the best things that they had going for them, that they had fought in Russia. Well, it really, it was one of the worst things after all, because they just couldn't replenish those men. They just couldn't do it. They would say you're back up to strength, but really it was like they had a 4-level grading system, 4 being the best, 1 being the worst. And like some of these divisions, they could get up to 2, and then you're back on the front line again. That's some of the best they could really do after Normandy. So the last thing I really want to talk about is the legacy of Normandy. And I really think of it as a legacy of hubris. Hubris on behalf of Hitler, because he just, even after the seeds of defeat were sown, and sown so clearly in front of them, or in front of him, that you couldn't even close your eyes and not be able to see it, he continued to believe the invasion would come elsewhere and that this was just a feint. And it was also hubris on behalf of the Allies, because the success of Operation Cobra after St. Lo fell drew a rose-colored sheet over the Allies for the remainder of the war. We went to Lorraine. The Alsace-Lorraine was where Patton went, and that's up here. And Montgomery went up into Holland. And both of them truly believed, while they were launching separate operations throughout 1944 and into 1945, the Germans are beat. We whipped them so hard in Normandy that they're done. We're going to have this thing done by Christmas. Well, Montgomery's Operation Market Garden failed terribly, and that's another lecture for another day. But it was absolutely horrific, because he underestimated the enemy, just as Hitler had done. And Patton, on the other hand, when he was advancing through Alsace-Lorraine to knock on Germany's doorstep, he couldn't believe it. Why aren't my men moving fast enough? We've beat the Germans. No, you haven't. Now they don't have offensive capability anymore, but they know what they're doing. And then finally, I think there's significant hubris on behalf of us as a culture moving forwards. We really look at Normandy with a simplistic narrative and through that same rose-colored sheet that happened in July of 1944. It was a resounding victory. It was something, it was one of the best, quote-unquote, best chapters of the war. It wasn't. It was the struggle of massive nation states in which civilians passed terribly, and young men were told to go terribly under or otherwise face incarceration. I will always remember standing at the American Cemetery at Omaha Beach on the bluffs and thinking, this is where the treasure of our country lies, in these graves. And it's really heartbreaking. So every single president since Jimmy Carter has visited the Normandy Cemetery. The Republicans love to believe that it was Reagan who went there first. It was actually Carter. Carter went there first, but we don't really talk about Jimmy Carter very much in this country. So this follows suit, but this isn't supposed to be political. This just goes to show how such a magnanimous, horrific event can be used for political grandstanding, which is perhaps one of the most offensive things that you could do with young men's legacies. And recently, I'm going to remark on the most recent president to have gone there. And this isn't meant to be political because this speaks on a deeper tone. It is a pulse upon which I'm trying to place our fingers in which how we look at the Normandy campaign in general. President Trump went in June of 2020 and said the following words: "We are gathered here on freedom's altar. On these shores, on these bluffs, thousands sacrificed their lives for the survival of liberty." Well, that's a really lovely sentiment. I think there's a lot true with that sentiment, but I also think there's a lot of improper idealization and generalization that does not give the reality of the true loss that we as a civilization saw at that place when we call it something as mystical and enchanting as the altar of freedom. It wasn't an altar of freedom. I've been there. It's one of the saddest places I've ever been. In 1990, President H.W. Bush compared Saddam Hussein to Hitler, said he was even worse than Hitler. Well, geez, we went after Hitler, we better go after Saddam Hussein if he's even worse. So what I'm saying here is that these events are being idealized and manipulated for current agendas, be it whatever they are. And the more we understand about them as they actually were, and appreciate them as they actually were, the less susceptible we are to these ideologies. So that's why I'm here, and that's why I'm doing this, and that's why I appreciate your time tonight. So now I'll take any questions you guys. I just really appreciate you guys. Yes, Robert.
How did the Germans get the panzers across the Seine River?
They had access to bridges behind their lines. They were able to move their tanks, and they were able to bring them over. It took them a little while, but they were eventually able to commit 8. I was able to find at one time 8 panzer divisions against the British and Canadians in Caen. So, I mean, you know, when people are coming really close to you, you destroy your bridges so they can't keep following you. But while you're still holding that area, you do everything you can to keep those bridges intact. And in the face of Allied air supremacy at the time, that was an incredible feat. But they did it. Mom, you had a question a little while ago. It did? Yes, Kathy.
What's the technical definition of bridgehead?
I mean, I've only come across it in military literature as a bridgehead.
What is it?
A bridgehead, when your back is against a water obstacle and you're attacking over that water obstacle to capture ground on the other side, in this case the water obstacle was the channel. Our objective as the Allies' objective was to attack and then bite hold, like a dog grabbing hold of a mailman's pants. You latch on and you hold on to whatever scrap you can get a hold of, and that's your bridgehead. You can do it when you're crossing a river, you can do it when you're crossing the ocean. That's the bridgehead. And it's an incredibly fragile thing and a dangerous place to be because your back is against a wall and you're surrounded on all sides. I like to think of it like nobody learns to fight faster than a man with his back to the wall. Well, you know, you fight or you survive or you don't in this kind of situation. Anything else?
How did people manage to survive?
And by that, define that.
Onslaught of, Omaha Beach.
Yeah.
When they're faced with everything pointed at them. How did people get by that? Just luck?
No. You know, it's half luck, half statistics, half, I don't know, divine intervention. But you know when all the little turtles are born and 100 turtles go and then the crabs and the crows come and maybe 2 out of 100 make it, but that 2 made it and that's why there's 100 in the first place? That's kind of what happened there. Yeah.
My father was a combat engineer on Omaha. I didn't land about the 6th. They had 70% casualties in their combat engineer unit.
Wow.
So it just shows you, there you go.
70?
7 out of 10 were killed or wounded.
Yeah.
So,
Trying to break,
Yeah.
so Andy, so your grandpa Wheeler,
Yeah.
so he was actually fighting?
So Grandpa Wheeler landed on, I think it was right around D+6 or D+7. He was one of the divisions that came across the channel, used the Mulberry Harbor system off the coast, and then was able to land and then was committed to the bridgehead here on the western side to help push against St. Lo. So what he was doing was he was somehow surviving as an infantryman, that leapfrog. And he famously became an alcoholic after the war and died in his early 60s. Yeah. I mentioned 2 men earlier from the 1st Infantry Division. who went ahead on Omaha and were pivotal. I mean, these men are mentioned unilaterally across the board. James Spaulding and Phil Strasik. These are men of the 1st Infantry Division who helped get the men off the beach by somehow getting to the cover and then finding men around them and then moving up. John Spaulding, he was pulled off the line with combat fatigue, which is a fancy way of saying he couldn't handle it anymore, and God knows who couldn't. He was pulled off the line with combat fatigue in 1945. So he kept fighting, and then eventually he couldn't, it was nothing, obviously I wouldn't say anything against somebody who had been in this situation, but it was just too much. So combat fatigue is what's put on your reports. 45, he was pulled off in combat fatigue. After the war, he was divorced. He came back changed and was divorced. And in 1959, he had a raging argument with his second wife, and his second wife killed him. So who knows what happened there, but he carried wounds with him for a long time. And Phil Strasik was wounded rather terribly in the back of his head, and his son gave a history stating he remembered when he was a little kid, you could put your finger in the hole in Daddy's neck, and that was the game. So he carried wounds, but he was evacuated with combat fatigue in the Hurtgen Forest in 1944. So he kept fighting, and he was sent off the line because he had reached his mental breaking point, and he had terrible nightmares every night. His son said that every night he had terrible nightmares, and in 1957 he took his own life. So when we talk about the legacy, what was the term? Freedom's altar, the survival of liberty, the glory of the breakout, the rose-colored glasses. Think of men like John Spaulding and Phil Strasik, who were casualties of Omaha Beach, 1959 and 1957. The only way we can look at these events is if we can look at them with the absolute conviction never to let it happen again. And all too often, if you hear it, it's like the dog whistle. Once you learn and you understand, you hear the dog whistle when somebody's talking about it, and it's like, no, what we did was right, and we should go do it again. Happened in 1990, and look what that did. We're just getting out, maybe. Been saying that for 10 years.
When did the Allied troops make it to Paris?
I don't have that date specifically here, but it was not long afterwards. August. Because August was, Operation Cobra kicked off at the end of July after St. Louis was captured. And then after that, it was a house of cards. The Germans had put so much effort here, and they were suddenly, like I said, the German officer said, the units that fell back into the Lorraine to fight Patton later were just of no use. So the ones that did survive were just shot to hell. So how do you defend against that? You don't. So what the Germans did was they actually fell back into the Alsace-Lorraine, they fell back into Holland, and they tried their best to regroup. And what they did was they actually fell back on the Siegfried Line, which is a story for another lecture perhaps, but it was a massive fortification belt on the borders of Germany. So Operation Cobra, which was made possible by the Herculean defensive efforts of Montgomery's Canadian and British troops over here against the SS Panzer divisions, this shattered the German army. And so it's kind of right. They were looking at it like, well, they're beat now. But that went too far in multiple cases. So the legacy of hubris, and I think we really need to caution ourselves against that when we look at historical events.
Very good.
Yeah.
Excellent, Andrew. Thank you. I learned a lot.
Aw.
Good job, man.
Aw, thanks, guys.
Is there a quiz?
Professor Wheeler.
Eat some of my mom's brownies. That's your quiz.